back to the Doctrine, Dogma, and Davide podcast. My name is Davide, and today I want to talk about the recent statements by Pope Francis responding to 5 dubia that were submitted by some of the Cardinals. If you're not familiar with what a dubia is, basically it's a question, it's a doubt that Cardinals or bishops will sometimes send to the Pope asking for clarification on certain points of theology or church law. And recently, 5 cardinals submitted some dubia, some questions for the Pope, asking for clarification ahead of the upcoming synod on synodality. Now, the Pope has recently responded to those dubia, and I want to start by just reading some of the headlines that I've seen about the Pope's response here. So we've got NBC News. Pope Francis signals he's open to blessings for same-sex unions by Catholic priests. Time Magazine, what the Pope's stance on blessing LGBTQ unions could mean. National Catholic Reporter, Pope signals openness to blessings for gay couples and study of women's ordination. Daily Post, Pope Francis hints on Catholic Church blessing same-sex marriages. LGBTQ Nation, Pope Francis suggests the Church can bless same-sex unions in an enormous advance for LGBTQ Catholics. And Time Magazine, again, Pope Francis says there could be ways to bless same-sex unions. Now, given the way that Pope Francis's response ad dubium, the way his statements are being interpreted in the popular media, and specifically mostly in the secular media, the question that we should be asking is, is it true? Did Pope Francis give approval for the blessing of so-called same-sex unions? And the answer is a simple and unequivocal no. Well, I went ahead and I actually read the Pope's response to the dubia submitted, and apparently that's something that most of the authors of these articles did not do, because at no point in his responses does the Pope state that it is acceptable for priests to bless so-called same-sex unions. The Pope does not even say the word same-sex union or same-sex marriage. And, it's a good thing he didn't, because quite frankly, it's a nonsense statement. The fact of the matter is, there is no such thing as a same-sex union. 2 people of the same sex cannot have a union the way a man and a woman can be unified. And so what's the deal? Why do all of these outlets seem to think that Pope Francis was giving the green light for the blessing of so-called same-sex unions? Why is everybody reporting this if it's not actually what he said? So I'm going to go ahead and take you guys through what the Pope actually said in this dubia so that we can get an understanding of what he's saying and, quite frankly, where maybe he did not phrase things properly and said things in a more ambiguous or confusing way. So this was the second dubium that the Pope responded to in response to the Cardinals' questions, and they asked about the claim that the widespread practice of the blessing of same-sex unions would be in accord with Revelation and the Magisterium. And so the Cardinals are asking, okay, would this actually be in accord with the Magisterium? And this is what the Pope had to say. First, the Church has a very clear conception of marriage, an exclusive, stable, and indissoluble union between a man and a woman, naturally open to the begetting of children. It calls this union marriage. Other forms of union only realize it in a partial and analogous way, and so they cannot be strictly called marriage. It is not a mere question of names, but the reality that we call marriage has a unique, essential constitution that demands an exclusive name not applicable to other realities. It is undoubtedly much more than a mere ideal. For this reason, the Church avoids any kind of rite or sacramental. By the way, blessings are a type of rite or sacramental. The Church avoids any kind of rite or sacramental that could contradict this conviction and give the impression that something that is not marriage is recognized as marriage. And so in the first 3 points of Pope Francis's response, which a lot of people just don't want to talk about, people on sort of more the left of the Church, and quite frankly those who dissent from the Church's traditional teaching on marriage and sexuality, they don't really want to talk about those first 3 points because the Pope is expounding the traditional Catholic understanding of marriage, and they don't like the traditional Catholic understanding of marriage. But I've noticed that a lot of sort of more traditionalists online are also just sort of ignoring those first 3 points because they would much rather, attack the Pope and accuse the Pope of intentionally sowing confusion or even being openly heretical in sort of the more ambiguous and the less clear portions of his response. But I think it's really important to acknowledge that the Pope starts out his response by clearly stating that marriage is a union between one man and one woman, and that it is indissoluble, open to children. He defines the essential elements of marriage and states that, anything else other than that cannot in any way be called marriage and cannot really properly be analogized to marriage. He even goes so far as to say that no blessing, no rite, no sacramental could be done in any way that would give the impression that this is in any way akin to marriage. And so Pope Francis starts off by saying you cannot have any ceremony, any blessing, any ritual that would give people the impression that, this is a marriage, that this is akin to marriage in any way. And so the Pope actually basically starts out by saying that you cannot actually bless the notion of same-sex unions, or at least that's how I read those first 3 points. All right, so now let's get to the rest of his response, where he does get a little bit more confusing, and he makes some theological distinctions that the average person might get a little bit confused about. He says, in dealing with people, however, we must not lose the pastoral charity that must permeate all our decisions and attitudes. The defense of objective truth is not the only expression of this charity, which is also made up of kindness, patience, understanding, tenderness, and encouragement. Therefore, we cannot become judges who only deny, reject, exclude. And this is certainly true. In John 16, verse 12, Jesus says, I still have much to teach you, but you cannot yet bear to hear it. And so even Jesus states in the Gospels that there's a time and a place to state certain things according to when the person is likely to be the most receptive to the revealed truth. We can never omit, the fundamental truths. We can never abandon the truth of the gospel. But that doesn't mean that we can't make a prudential judgment about the time, place, and manner, the ways in which the truth may be presented, so as to maximize the probability that they will accept the truth that they hear and come to faith in Jesus Christ. Because Pope Francis is right when he says that, our job is not to condemn, to exclude, to marginalize. Ultimately, our goal, our fidelity to the truth is oriented towards bringing people into a better life and ultimately bringing them into eternal life. The reason we maintain that fidelity to the truth is out of care and concern for these people. And so there is an importance in being sort of pastoral and charitable and kind and sort of picking the correct moment to present the truth to people, as well as being, faithful to the truth and not glossing over it or trying to say that, it's totally fine for you to be in an objectively sinful situation. Now, Pope Francis goes on to say, quote, for this reason, pastoral prudence must adequately discern whether there are forms of blessing requested by one or more persons that do not transmit a mistaken conception of marriage. For when a blessing is requested, one is expressing a request for help from God, a plea for a better life, a trust in a Father who can help us to live better. So this is where we get into sort of a little bit more controversial portion of Pope Francis's response, and where people are accusing the Pope of sort of opening the door to the blessing of same-sex marriage, or entertaining the possibility of blessing so-called same-sex unions. Now, the portion of this that some people are either criticizing or celebrating, depending on, sort of which side of the spectrum you fall, is the Pope says that there may be forms of blessings requested by one or more persons. But they're also leaving out the very important sentence that immediately follows that, which do not portray a mistaken conception of marriage. And so what's really important here is that Pope Francis is actually explicitly stating that any sort of blessing that you give to either one or more persons, even if you have two people in a same-sex coupling, it cannot transmit a faulty notion of marriage. It cannot resemble marriage or, properly speaking, a union in any way. It could be that there are two people who are seeking help to live chastely. Now, that's not to say that this paragraph doesn't have some very critical ambiguities in it that I would criticize, because the fact of the matter is the way that the Pope phrases it, that there could be blessings for one or more persons that do not transmit a faulty notion of marriage. One could misunderstand, and it's very clear that many people are misunderstanding that to mean that maybe you could have a same-sex relationship and, it's not a marriage, but maybe just that relationship could be blessed. And so there is some ambiguity in exactly what the Pope is saying here that I think is reasonable to criticize. And it also ignores, quite frankly, the popular conceptualization of what a blessing means. Because when Pope Francis states that when somebody requests a blessing, they are requesting help from God, a plea for a better life, a trust in a Father who can help us to live better. And so one might say that, like, oh, I want a blessing so that I can have help living more chastely and living more in accord with God's commandments. But the popular conceptualization of what a blessing would entail is an endorsement of that person as they are, when in fact we are all wretched sinners in desperate need of God's mercy. The blessing is so that we can rise to be better than we are, not be confirmed in our present sin. And so because there's this misconception about what a blessing truly entails, I think it is incredibly irresponsible for the Pope to phrase this response in this particular way that allows for such a gross misinterpretation of the Church's teaching here. So to sort of sum up Pope Francis's response to this particular dubia, the question of, like, did the Pope open the door for the blessing of so-called same-sex unions or even same-sex marriages? The answer is an unequivocal no. That is not what the Pope did. But the Pope did phrase portions of his response to this dubia in ways that could easily and reasonably confuse someone who is not particularly well informed about sort of the subtle details of the theology on this question. And I don't think that it is necessarily disrespectful to the Holy Father to critique a prudential judgment that he makes when we think he has phrased something unwisely or imprudently. Because while we must always be respectful to the Holy Father, he is the Holy Father, he's the vicar of Christ on earth. He is not infallible except for when he speaks ex cathedra. And so we are well within our rights to lovingly, charitably, and respectfully critique certain areas where we feel that the Pope could do better. While at the same time, I think it's incredibly important that we make those critiques in good faith and not assume things about the Holy Father based on his writings beyond that which he expressly states. Now, that being said, the Pope also had another response in this dubia that I found very interesting and frankly a little bit concerning. Now, this one was a little bit overshadowed by the Pope's statements on the possibility of blessing one or multiple people, so long as that blessing doesn't give a false impression of marriage. But this is still another matter that I think it's really important to clarify sort of what the Church teaches and exactly what it is that Francis is saying and where maybe he is phrasing things poorly and how we as the Church must sort of like respond and understand the Pope's statements here. And this is on his response to dubium number 4, dubium about pastors' and theologians' support for the theory that the theology of the Church has changed and therefore that priestly ordination can be conferred on women. And this has made some headlines about people speculating about whether or not women could be ordained to the sacerdotal priesthood, whether women may be ordained as clerics. And so I want to talk about this response as well. So Pope Francis responds first, the common priesthood of the faithful and the ministerial priesthood differ essentially. It is not convenient to maintain a difference of degree that implies considering the common priesthood of the faithful as something of second category or of lesser value or lower degree. Both forms of priesthood mutually enlighten and sustain each other. And so what the Pope is saying here is he's making the distinction between sort of the common baptismal priesthood that all of the faithful share. There is a sort of common priesthood of all the faithful where we are given the Grand Commission to preach the gospel to all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit. But he does make the clear distinction that there is an essential difference between just sort of the natural priestly order of the faithful and the actual sacerdotal order that we call the sacrament of holy orders. They're very essentially different things, but one does not make one better than the other. Both are essential to the Church. Both are essential to the life of the Church, and being a cleric does not make you better than somebody who is married, even though you have different roles, and one must submit to the other within the hierarchy of the Church. Francis goes on to say, when St. John Paul II taught that it is necessary to affirm definitively the impossibility of conferring priestly ordination on women, he was in no way belittling women and granting supreme power to men. St. John Paul II also affirmed other things. For example, that when we speak of priestly power, quote, we are in the area of function, not of dignity or holiness. Now, this is plainly true that the reservation of priestly ordination to men does not imply a superiority of men over women. As Adam said in Genesis, here at last is one who is truly my equal, bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh. But human beings are two sexes, male and female, and the two sexes are complementarity with one another. They are not interchangeable, but they are still equal in dignity and righteousness in the eyes of God. And so being able to be ordained as a priest does not imply that one is superior to the other. There is simply a difference of nature here. And that is what Pope Francis is quoting St. Pope John Paul II in saying. And Pope Francis goes on to sort of go into a little bit more detail about that, but nothing he says there is particularly problematic, and so I'm going to skip past that paragraph and go on to his point C, where he says, quote, "On the other hand, to be rigorous, let us recognize that a clear and authoritative doctrine has not yet been exhaustively developed about the exact nature of a definitive statement. It is not a dogmatic definition, and yet it must be observed by all. No one can publicly contradict it, and yet it can be the object of study, as in the case with the validity of ordinations in the Anglican Communion." And this is sort of a very recurring theme within Francis's pontificate and statements, the sort of "let's talk about it" trope. Let's discuss what a definitive statement even means. Let's talk about, how we interpret all of this. Let's talk about it. Sure, some people will say things that are heretical, but, that's just part of the conversation. And I think that this is a very misguided statement. I think that this is a very foolish thing to say. He states that, we haven't truly explored exactly what it means for something to be a definitive statement. What does a definitive statement even mean? Well, to me, I would think that what a definitive statement constitutes is quite obvious. It is definitive. It is not subject to review. It is not subject to contention. Now, that doesn't mean that we can't discuss it. We can discuss all that we like. But for the Pope to say, we need to talk about it. Let's talk about it more. Let's have the discussion. It'd be a lot like if a bunch of physicists got together and said, let's just discuss what the world would be like if the force of gravity were 4.8 meters per second squared rather than 9.8 meters per second squared. They could have that discussion. They could talk about what would happen, and maybe some of them would say, hey, it would be really great if we were to change the force of gravity to be just 9.8 meters per second squared. But ultimately, the question that we have to ask is, would that conversation actually be fruitful? Because at the end of the day, no matter how beneficial you might think it would be to reduce the force of gravity, we have no authority and no power to do it. And that, by the way, is exactly what St. Pope John Paul II said in his definitive statement, that the Church has no authority to confer priestly ordination on women. This is not something that the Church can do. Well, Pope Francis is sort of correct in saying that we can discuss what it really means for something to be definitively stated by the Holy See. The fact of the matter is, he's also right in saying that no one can reasonably publicly contradict this statement and still be considered a faithful Catholic because it was definitively stated by the Bishop of Rome, demanding the submission and belief by all Christians. And so just because we can talk about something doesn't mean that conversation is necessarily prudent or fruitful. And this is where I have some criticisms for Pope Francis, because his statement, we should talk about, what exactly does a definitive statement even mean? What did Pope John Paul II really mean when he stated that the Church has no authority to confer priestly ordination upon women? We can have those discussions, but those discussions can't really go very far, because quite frankly, Pope John Paul II was not particularly ambiguous in his definitive statement on the possibility of conferring priestly ordination on women. He was not particularly ambiguous on this subject. And for the Pope to say something essentially along the lines of, we can't contradict this definitive statement, but we can sort of discuss what it means, quite frankly, it's very harmful and scandalous to the Church for the Pope to be saying things like that in such a confusing time, because people interpret, let's discuss this as though it is open to review or open to revision, which this obviously is not. And just to make it absolutely clear to everyone listening just how explicit and clear Pope John Paul II was in making this definitive statement in his apostolic letter, I'm going to read just sort of the last clause of the apostolic letter, which states, "Although the teaching that the priestly ordination is to be reserved to men alone has been preserved by the constant and universal tradition of the Church and firmly taught by the magisterium in its more recent documents, at the present time in some places it is nonetheless considered still open to debate, or the Church's judgment that women are not to be admitted to ordination is considered to have a merely disciplinary force. Wherefore, in order that all doubt may be removed regarding the matter of great importance, a matter which pertains to the Church's divine constitution itself, in virtue of my ministry of confirming the brethren, I declare that the Church has no authority whatsoever to confer priestly ordination on women, and that this judgment is to be definitively held by all the Church's faithful. Invoking an abundance of divine assistance upon you, venerable brothers, and upon all the faithful, I impart my apostolic blessing. So while yes, we can discuss what exactly that particular apostolic letter means, there are very few reasonable interpretations of that letter because it is not particularly ambiguous. And for the Pope to say, well, let's discuss it, it will give people the wrong idea. It will lead people into error. And so I think that this was a very misguided statement for the Holy Father to make. But with that, I'm going to go ahead and leave it there. I hope that I was able to bring sort of some clarity and, maybe even give you a little bit more peace of mind about what exactly it is that the Pope is saying versus what he's not saying. If you found this video fruitful, I hope you'll give it a like, comment, do whatever it is that people of the internet do. And I now have a Discord server. And so if you want to click the link for the Discord server in the description below, feel free to come chat, hang out in the Discord server. I'm obviously on there. But with that, I will see you guys next week. God bless you.